differentiation of the government-controlled oversight and then the regulatory agency. So, with the direct government regulations, what advantages do we have when we are looking at government control? One, you have easy access to policymakers. I mean, if the Minister of Finance is the one who is in charge of regulation, you always have access to him because he has to make policies. And we mean, by policymakers, we mean the people who drive decisions that will impact on the industry. Secondly, there is the inherent enforcement powers. You have the executive oversight, and the executive has those inherent enforcement powers. They have the investigators, they have the police, they have the prisons. So that is usually another pro to that. And then you'll always get policies that tend to favor the consumer. Consumer protection is usually a key advantage. Why? Because the government by nature is political, and they'll tend to drive towards policies that favor consumers because those are their voters. And then lastly, it's easy to get budget allocations since you have the Minister of Finance who drafts out the budget, so you are set when it comes to budgets. But on the disadvantage side is we have a government that is large and you have bureaucracy attaching there. So you tend to find that implementation of policies are usually a bit slow. The government has so many programs going. It's macroeconomic in nature. So sometimes you find the insurance industry issues are left behind. And then also policy making becomes unpredictable. You have a politician making policy, and this tends to change from one politician to another. So for an insurance company to plan into the future, that becomes a bit difficult. And then decision making, of course, will lack independence because they are driven with their own agendas, political agendas. And half the time for government regulatory agencies, you'll find most of their policies are reactive in nature. You're having issues, that's when they'll come with a policy to address that. Rarely are they forward-looking. And then you also have less visibility for the regulator. Half the time, the minister will drive conversation and the regulator will not be seen. When you go to the regulatory agency, what are you looking at? Some of the positives. You have a small agency that has been created specifically to address the needs of the sector. So you have a dedicated agency, and that means they are able to address the needs of the sector without being interrupted by other issues. Also, policies are proactive because most of these agencies are required to come up with work plans, with strategy plans for the industry. So they tend to be more forward-looking in nature. And then they are accountable not only to the government but to the stakeholders, because the stakeholders are their reason for existence. And then there's more visibility for the regulator. Why? He's the first point of call and the last point of call. So whatever goes wrong with regulation in the industry or oversight, there's always one point of reference, and that's the regulator, and is usually more visible. On the disadvantage of the regulatory agency, sometimes if you don't get a very well-structured agency, they can be victims of political stakeholder capture. I mean, if there are too many powers resting with the minister, despite having a regulatory agency overseeing your oversight, sometimes they don't work well. And then sometimes regulatory agencies may not have powers to enforce oversight effectively. Or sometimes the agency may be removed from key policy makers. They don't have access to the minister, they don't have access to parliament, so it becomes a little bit harder to push policy. And then lastly, if the budget allocation structure is not very appropriate, you'll find the regulatory agency may lack funds, thereby hindering its work.